So I wanted to ask you first about your influences and who were your biggest influences as a poet?
I think definitely my teachers. So I did a master's in poetry with Derek Walcott and Robert Pinsky and Rosanna Warren, and also Hajin, who is better known as a prose writer, but is also actually a wonderful poet. So I guess that's where I would start. But then, you know, since then I've read widely, obviously, and Adrienne Rich, Carolyn Kaiser, William Carlos Williams, Elizabeth Bishop, you know, all the greats. Yeah. All of the greats.
These teachers of yours, they served the purpose of a mentor almost to you?
They were all in very different ways extremely kind to me, and were very generous with their time and attention. Each, as I said, in their own sort of unique style. Derek Walcott was, I think more than anything else for me, a model of how to live as a creative person.
How did he live?
He lived the way he wanted to, which I think is something very much to be admired. Although, I mean, you know, by the time I knew him, he had won a Nobel Prize. He, you know, owned his own island. He was wealthy and very well respected, one could say revered, I think for very good reason. I think he was, until he died, probably the most important living poet. But he had a kind of confidence and clarity of intent. He knew what he wanted to do, and he was completely uncompromising, as far as I could tell, in that. And I found that as a very young, very inexperienced, very innocent person, in addition to writer, extremely inspiring. And I still do, actually. I still think of him as a model.
You carry those with you?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
What's the difference between having an influence, like another poet who you don't know, who's dead already, and having someone who you interact with? What is that difference?
Well, I think it's very, very different. Because the personality of the writer, I think, inevitably becomes sort of entwined with their work, if you know the poet. And that can work to its advantage and to its disadvantage. So, you know, no one is a perfect human being. And yet I do think that there are some close to perfect works.
Okay.
So when I read Elizabeth Bishop, for example, I think, like One Art, for example, which I think is pretty close to a perfect poem, nothing of Elizabeth Bishop's personality or personal life necessarily interferes with that. Whereas when I read the work of a living poet, there are all these extrinsic things that enter in.
And you let those enter in. Because the fact that it changes means that only the people who know the poet have this experience of how does knowing the poet change the way you read a poem.
Yes. And I think sometimes it's a positive influence. Frequently it's a positive influence. Because you gain insight into where the poem came from, right? What's behind the poem. And in some ways I think that can enrich the poem. But, you know, a lot of it is gossip, too. It's just gossip.
Gossip?
Yeah, you know. I mean, you know, the love life of a poet or the, you know, political attitudes of the poet or, you know, all of those things.
In reading your book, what popped out to me immediately, and I have this face in the Shanghai metro that just is the rhythm and the sounds and how I forgot the name, it's not alliteration when you have different consonants. In that introduction, the blue font of your book, there's this voice that comes out. So I wanted to ask you, like, what was the process of you finding this voice? When did it begin?
It's not a book as such. I didn't write it as a book, which is to say, I wrote each of those individual poems over a fairly long period of time. So there are actually some poems in there that come from my graduate student days. some in fairly intact form and others that have been revised over and over through the years. So that voice, I think, changes through the book. I think actually there's a varied texture to the book. But, you know, I think of my voice as very much a work in progress, continually developing, continually changing. And I think that's probably true for a lot of writers, that you always feel like that stagnation is a kind of death.
Yeah.
That you always want to be learning and writing better stuff and writing in different ways and experimenting and pressing out on your own boundaries.
And your work as a translator, how did you come across Chinese poetry? Was it in college?
So I've been extremely fortunate in my life in many ways, and one of those ways is how I sort of came to this life as a writer about China, among other things, and as a translator. So I did start reading Chinese literature, although, like many, my first exposure was to ancient stuff, Tang Shi mainly. And then after college, I moved to Shanghai. And lived and worked here and studied as well. I was teaching English and studying Chinese at a private school, which no longer exists, and started reading as practice. At that point, I was writing poetry. I knew I wanted to be a writer of some sort, although I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I wanted it. And I was very interested in Chinese poetry sort of on a language level, but also on a cultural level and a literary level. I wanted to know what was going on in this other culture, or what had been going on in this other culture. And when I returned to the States, so I went back to the States to go to grad school and started translating in a workshop run by Rosanna Warren, which at the time was a very famous translation workshop. She would bring in working translators to the class to talk to us about practice, how they actually did what they did, which is very different from a sort of removed academic, theoretical perspective on translation. This was like actually active people doing it in the trenches. So we had to do a portfolio as part of that class, and I translated some poems by Wang Xiaoni, who still remains one of my favorite poets. And now when I look back at them, they are, I hope nobody ever sees those poems. I'll put it that way. Okay. But I did publish them at the time. And when I published them, I thought, you know, they were taken immediately by a literary magazine. And I thought, you know, this is a great racket. Yeah. I mean, they're just going to publish these things? Great. Yeah. So I started a couple of different projects through that, sort of translating ancient poetry. And then in 2007, I had one of those life-changing moments when I met a young Chinese poet, Wang Xiaoni, who is in the States now and had come to the States to do a PhD. And he's, at that time, was known as kind of like the big young thing. He was the up-and-coming guy. And he said, why are you translating this old stuff? Nobody's translating new stuff. Why don't you translate contemporary poetry? And I said, 我不敢. Like, no way, I don't know anything, I don't know anybody, I've never read any of it, like, I don't know, you know. And he said, okay, well, I'll introduce you to everybody, and we can collaborate. And so that's exactly what happened. I came to Beijing that year, spent a couple months in Beijing, and Wang Xiaoni just gave me an introduction to that whole world. Yeah. And we started collaborating on translations together. Yeah. So that was my launching point into translation of contemporary stuff. Okay. Yeah.
Because there's a text that's given out a lot in intro to poetry classes called "What is Poetry" by a guy named Walcott, John E. Walcott. And in the first part, he tries to differentiate between prose and poetry. What is one? And he says, well, is it the meter? No. prose has meter? Is it the fact that it's divided by lines? No, because there's prose poetry. What is it? And he comes into a conclusion from Auden or Eliot, I forgot who it was, who said poetry is that which is untranslatable. It's that in which the words are the end. So I wanted to ask you that. Is it the same poem? Do you find yourself having some sort of authorship, even in the minimum way, into these poems that you translate into English?
Yeah, I think that is a perennial problem, not in the sense of, it's a perennial question. I mean, I think poetry can be translated. It has always been translated. And we take it for granted, actually, that poetry can be translated. I mean, we look at the classics.
Yeah.
They're all in other languages.
Yeah.
And yet, we accept them frequently without even thinking about them as translated texts. Yeah. So I remember going through my whole schooling and reading,
Iliad.
The Iliad, the Odyssey, Baudelaire, Rilke, I mean, reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and it never being commented upon that, these are translated texts, these words that you're actually reading are not the original words.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, and as a practicing translator, I think it's obvious that poetry can be translated. However, having said that, I mean, translating poetry is a practice of loss. You're always losing something, always, inevitably. You're also gaining something, which is when you utilize the tools of the target language that you're translating into fully. You always gain something as well. I do think of my translations as my own, in a certain sense. Those are my words.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, they have a source that is not internal. There's an external source. So and my attitudes toward them are different from my attitudes towards my own original work. So, for example, in the case of my translations, I love editors. I think editors are fantastic.
How so?
I'm so grateful to my editors, because a good editor makes you look good. They find your mistakes, they offer suggestions, they can smooth places out. I'm very, very grateful to the good editors that I've had, and I have had many. In terms of my own work, I am much more protective, because there is a kind of original conception that you don't want necessarily to be interfered with. So I do accept edits on my own work, and especially my prose work. I think, editors, again, can be very helpful. But with my poetry, I do feel a certain protectiveness.
Why not with your prose? Why is it something specific to poetry?
I think with prose, there's more space, in a certain sense. I mean, because and this speaks to actually your first point about the translatability of poetry. Poetry is in part about the words, the way of saying something. And prose can be that way, certainly, just not the kind of prose that I happen to write. I think of my prose as getting across an ideas or stories, or something that is not necessarily in the words themselves. However, in my poetry, I'm trying to do something musical, rhythmic, emotional, and that's a different enterprise.
What do you think that Western poets can learn from Eastern poets?
I can only speak to what American poets can learn from Chinese poets.
Yes. More specific, the best.
I think they can learn a lot. Primary among them, I think, Chinese poets are writing with a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake. There's a political aspect. There's an artistic aspect in terms of the very, very, very long continuum of Chinese literary output. Yeah. There's a kind of intensity to Chinese writing that I really admire, and that I think American poets can really learn from. I think that's changing, however. I mean, since the last election, there has been a sense of urgency in American letters that I think has been missing in my sort of consciousness as a, say 20 years of being conscious of the contemporary scene. I think there really is a new sense of, what, words matter. How you use words matter.
Is that something, though, that can be attained without having, the election hadn't happened? Is that something that happens because of the context, or it comes out of the poet itself?
I think both.
Okay.
I mean, I think there were some poets who have always been engaged with really important questions in a very intense way.
Yeah.
And I could name lots of different examples, but I do think the overall, sort of the larger scene, the scene writ large, I do think it helps when there is a sense of emergency, when there's a sense of things that you care about really being under attack. That tends to move the literary conversation in a certain direction. Which is not to say that people haven't been writing about I mean, I'm thinking of Robert Pinsky's Gulf Music, which is about the Iraq War and our interference in the Middle East, or Robert Haas writing about American military intervention, or Rita Dove writing about race relations in the U.S., or Dehimba Jess writing about, Southern racism. Like, there have been wonderful poets writing wonderful things this whole time. There always will be. But I do think the conversation in general is more engaged with these questions. And I'm not saying just explicitly political poetry. I'm saying that the sense that it matters what you say and how you say it.
You think, like in the United States, there's some form of, does it come from insecurity? Is it something like disregard to poetry?
I think American poets have taken for granted certain freedoms, certain privileges, a certain position in the world, such that you could really write whatever you wanted, and it was okay. I think now we're in a moment where people are realizing that domestically and also internationally, globally, those assumptions are not necessarily true anymore.
Okay. And when you translate something, let's say you translate a poem with rhythm, meter, and rhyme, and you just said that, there's always a loss in translation. What do you prioritize? What is something that always has to come through?
Every translator is going to prioritize something different, and I think that prioritization, to my mind, the way that I work, ideally it changes for the poem.
Okay.
So if I'm working with a poem which is, has end rhyme, and that is clearly something that the poet has worked for, then I'm going to prioritize not necessarily end rhyme in my final version, but some kind of response to that musically in the translation. So if there's a lot of wordplay in the original, a lot of alliteration or consonants, as you were saying earlier, or assonance or whatever's going on, I want some kind of reflection of that in the oral texture of my translation. Contemporary poetry, contemporary Chinese poetry, at least what I work with, tends to be very close to American free verse. There's not a lot of end rhyme. There is a lot of wordplay. There is a lot of sound play. But frequently the structure is not as important. Formal structure.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do, as a translator, I work very hard to keep whatever structure is there. So, for example, the integrity of the line, I really try, for the most part, to keep the line the same in the English and in the Chinese. Sometimes that's impossible, just because of the grammatical structures being so different between the two languages. But I'm very aware of that as a problem. I prioritize meaning. So I'm not a fan of sort of cultural equivalencies. If it's, you know, if it's a reference to like the yi in China, I'm not going to translate that into like Apache, you know? That's my personal sort of ethos as to what a translation is and should be. At the same time, I'm willing to sacrifice some of the original in order to make a beautiful poem in English. So sometimes you encounter something, a kind of what turns into a wordiness in English, if you're trying to sort of literally translate, and I'll cut. Then in that case, if I think it's wordy in English, I'll cut. Not to change the meaning, but to condense the language. So that my texts, my translations, could be used in a classroom, but it's not going to be a sort of one by one sort of equivalency. Because I'm trying to make poems that can be read and enjoyed by a purely English-speaking readership.
Got it. And now, take back that girl in university. Where did you go to university again, undergrad?
Undergrad at Amherst College in Central.
Amherst, okay. What advice would you give to her as a young American poet?
Keep going. Keep going. Everything will try to discourage you. You will be rejected 1,000 times. People will tell you your work is no good. You will get turned down for everything under the sun. You will reach for things that disappear. You will see other people get what you want. But keep going. I think the single thing that determines success or failure in the literary world is persistence. If you can keep going and you have some modicum of talent and you're passionate about what you do, you'll make it.